Good morning. The pandemic, Partygate. You wouldn't be blamed for wondering if we've gone back to the future this week. Private messages exploded into the public eye. Sweary WhatsApps from Matt Hancock about lockdown, his love affair, and the rest. A distraction from Rishi Sunak's relative success getting a new deal with the EU.
I'm pleased to report that we have now made a decisive breakthrough.
We also both knew, dear Rishi, that we could do it.
After weeks of nerves, most Brexiteers seemed willing to give it a chance. But
I'm going to find it very difficult to vote for something myself.
Surely Boris Johnson wouldn't set out to stir the pot, facing trial by MP over whether he misled us all about what happened at number 10. New photos with bottles of booze on the desk. He still says he did nothing wrong. And pointed to Labour's shock hiring of the civil servant Sue Gray, who investigated what really happened under number 10's roof. With the return of Partygate and the pandemic, we have one big question this morning. Why is it so hard for the government to escape the recent past? With us live, the man who's been fixing one of Rishi Sunak's toughest problems, Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary. Will he tell us what's in his WhatsApps? What about Labour's John Ashworth, the man who wants to get millions back to work? Labour's Shadow Work and Pension Secretary is here too. The next contender to take on one of the biggest jobs in politics, wannabe Scotland's First Minister, Ash Regan, joins us live. And as new laws to tackle the worst of social media grind through Parliament, we talk to one grieving parent with a clear message for the big tech firms. And with me at the desk, Fraser Nelson, the editor of the Tory Bible, The Spectator, who has seen all of those WhatsApps. Hannah Fry, mathematician and broadcaster, is back on the magic of maths. And Sam Tarry, Labour MP for Ilford South, proud trade unionist, who's not afraid of rankling Party HQ. Welcome to the programme. It does feel a bit like we've gone back in time this week with two big sprawling messes, products of the massive events of recent years, Partygate and the pandemic. Does any of this damage today's leaders, and does it bother you? Well, let's see what the papers reckon with the front pages today. The Sunday Telegraph thinks it matters. They splash with a message from Matt Hancock, then Health Secretary, saying they were trying to frighten the pants off the public. The Observer says some Conservatives think Boris Johnson is behaving like Donald Trump. Let's look at the tabloids. Two of them go with splashes from Prince Harry's latest interview with a therapist live on TV, and the Sunday Express nodding to a story that will become a big deal in the next few days, Rishi Sunak's new laws to try to stop boats coming across the channel. So plenty to talk about. Welcome, all of you. Fraser, let's talk first of all about the Telegraph. Now, we will talk about the big issues around lockdown, which is the conversation the paper's been trying to promote. But there is lots of unhappiness about how this emerged. And in case people have been living under a rock, the journalist Isabel Oakeshott was given these WhatsApps to help Matt Hancock write his book. What he didn't think she would then do is to give them to a newspaper. And this has bothered people. One of our viewers has got in touch to say, surely it's in the public interest that journalists keep their promises and operate with integrity.
What's in the public interest is journalists do their job, and the job of a journalist is to shine a light on things that ministers would rather kept in darkness. In this case, Isabel Oakeshott had an incredible opportunity to put into the public domain all of these conversations. It's the biggest document dump ever made available to journalists or historians, certainly in my lifetime, that can explain not one, but dozens, scores, even hundreds of things that people were trying to keep from us at the time. Now, ethically, there is no real contest here. I'm not aware of any.
Really?
I'm not aware of any journalist anywhere who says that she should not have made these things public.
But she had signed a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah, and lots of whistleblowers and those things will think about public interest, and there are usually rules to protect them in doing that. So as a result, it's not just, by the way, a document dump. The Daily Telegraph has had a team of 21 journalists going at this for weeks on end to make sure that people are told. There's a whole bunch of things that we would never otherwise know about. And the inquiry itself might take until the end of the decade. So are we really all to keep quiet about that until then.
But if it's all about transparency and telling the full story, why not then publish them all? And then people could judge it for themselves, because the Telegraph has been accused, and by some allies of Matt Hancock, saying you're giving a partial version of events to fit in with the argument that the newspaper wants to make, was that lockdown was too long, too harsh, and was a mistake.
I completely agree. What we should have now is way more publication. For example,
Publish them all.
Well, the inquiry has got all of these messages. Why not publish them all right now? Why sit on it until after the election for years to come? This is a conversation that we need to have now, because there will be another pandemic, another pathogen along in the future. And what possible chance have we got of getting it right next time?
Should the paper publish them all? If you're so convinced of the public interest, should the paper publish them all? You're one of the few people in the country who's actually gone through every single message. Why not put them all in the public domain?
Well, you'll be pleased to know there's lots more to come. So there's several more days of this. There are something like the whole files are 4 times the size of War and Peace. So, I mean, like, the only comparative I can think about is the Nixon tapes when he was recorded in the White House. Now, it took sort of decades to publish all of those things. There's a lot, and some of it, by the way, is genuinely not in the public interest to disclose. But what the most important things are being released day by day, each of them opening a vital public conversation we'd never would have had it not been for the investigation.
Now, Hannah, one of the messages that was published yesterday suggests that the government knew Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme was actually causing a spike in infections because it was encouraging people back out into the public domain. Now, you were working with some of the scientists who were involved in producing the data. Was that a concern at the time?
Of course, there were all kinds of concerns at the time. And I think that's one of the things about this story is that, you know, lives are lived forwards but understood backwards. And I think that by viewing everything that happened through this lens of knowing with hindsight what went on to happen, but also just this very particular kind of cherry-picked series of messages, I think it kind of skews the idea that actually I think at the time a lot of people were very sensible, a lot of people were very compassionate, did the right thing and knew that being in crowded spaces wasn't the right thing to do. And I do think that at that time, even the commentary at the time really noticed that the government messaging was kind of screeching into one direction and screeching into another, and could have been and perhaps should have been a lot more consistent throughout.
Sam, one of the interesting things through that whole period, which we all remember, is that Labour pretty much always went with the government. Now, as Hannah's been reminding us all, it was sort of a scramble. You know, people were trying to work out the right thing to do. But do you think Labour were really opposing properly at that time, really interrogating the information?
Well, look, I mean, to be honest, I was actually calling for harsher lockdowns and for them to be brought in more bluntly, because actually the evidence that was quite apparent in my constituency is that when the Eat Out to Help Out scheme happened, there was a spike. There was a spike in deaths. People have literally lost their lives because of that in Ilford South and probably many similar kind of, you know, urban communities across the country. We knew that within weeks. So actually my question really is that, yes, it's important this stuff's come out, but actually what are the consequences can be? And I want to see that full report when that's done, because I think, you know, it is important. I do actually agree with Fraser that all of those messages are published and as soon as possible. I think Isabel will have to deal with the sort of journalistic sort of integrity issues herself on that. But, you know, it's confirming things that we knew at the time that government ministers were aware of and then just ploughed on, and that is indefensible in my view.
But have we really learnt new things? I mean, you've both interestingly said it's sort of confirmed what we knew already. Now, we've got lots of sort of salacious colour, a bit of swearing chucked in there to tell. But do you think, Sam, it's told us things we didn't know?
Yes, I think it shows that the government really didn't have a serious kind of like strategy. I think they weren't necessarily listening to the evidence. I think, you know, I mean, this stuff about scaring the population and so forth, this is clearly sort of problematic. But at the time, you know, we have to remember Labour was obviously offering support. And, you know, from my point of view, and I will say this, you know, those lockdowns that were brought in, I don't agree with the sort of editorial line from the Telegraph whatsoever. They saved lives. And actually, I called for harsher lockdowns at the time. They might not have been popular, but I'd rather have my residents still alive than those that have lost their lives.
Well, maybe we are now starting to have the conversation about those big decisions that were taken in such a scramble, but also, you know, roaring back from the recent past has been the question of Partygate. Now, I'm sure most viewers will have noticed this week more photographs emerging. MPs have found 4 occasions where Boris Johnson might have misled Parliament. Now, Fraser, you know the Tory party inside out. What does this do for Boris Johnson's reputation?
To be honest, not very much. I'd be surprised if anybody reading revelations of the last few days is surprised by it. What this actually comes together with the lockdown files, because we see that behind the scenes there was an incredibly flippant atmosphere, that they spoke about scaring the general public while having parties themselves completely deplorable, doing things they were sending the police after others if they were to do that. That hypocrisy ultimately was what did for Boris Johnson. Now, he might say that, Sue Gray was biased. Look, this is civil servant who investigated me, has now gone to work for Keir Starmer.
Do you buy that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, because the parliamentary inquiry has found exactly the same. I mean, the facts are the facts here. They were having parties at the time where they were literally going the next day to plan how to crack down, send the police after, give Plod the marching orders, was Matt Hancock's language. And that's, by the way, you ask what we know now from the lockdown files that we didn't know before. What we now see is evidence of this kind of toxic culture where they were being incredibly gung-ho. They started off very cautious, open-minded, ended up just incredibly comfortable with the huge powers they'd given themselves to lock people up, even laughing about people being locked up, at the same time as they themselves were behaving in a terrible way.
But Hannah, you followed all of this obviously as a scientist, but you're also a voter and a citizen. I mean, what comes into your mind when these stories about all of this emerge?
Well, I think especially when you put the two of those stories together, for anybody who feels like the government was treating the public with contempt at the time, it certainly doesn't help, does it? I think the language that's being used to describe it, and as you say, the kind of flippancy of it all. I mean, there are literally photos of Boris at these parties, and it's almost a sort of, it's a bit pathetic, really.
Everyone has heard the stories. Myself, I couldn't see my sister when she had a newborn baby. I've got constituents who couldn't, hold the hand of their loved one when they died. And so just seeing these like full-on parties, people just on the razzle, in Downing Street and other places. Boris tried to dodge the bullet on that, but now it's quite clear that, and it's confirmed that he was there and absolutely did break the rules. And I think there's also a problem for the Prime Minister, who clearly has already been fined. What else did he know? I think that's a problem. It's just going to roll on. And that hypocrisy is totally undermined the government.
Well, certainly these big issues are definitely very much back in the public conversation and back in the public's minds. Thank you all three of you for now, but stay with us because in Rishi Sunak's world, this could have been a week to bask in the glory of doing his new deal with the EU to sort out how trading rules work in Northern Ireland after many months of fraught talks. But, as we've been discussing, the past roared back with those WhatsApps from Matt Hancock, those pictures of Partygate, that report from MPs. Perhaps it's rather difficult for the government to move on. Chris Heaton-Harris is the Northern Ireland Secretary and was one of Team Johnson when he was trying to hang on to power. And I'm pleased to say he's with us here in the studio now. Let's start with the pandemic. Was the government's strategy to scare the pants off people, as Matt Hancock said?
No, I don't think it was. I think the government's strategy was to try and protect the British public as best it possibly could, to try and protect the British economy as best it properly could, and to try and give as much information as it possibly could at the right times, which is why you saw Chris Whitty out on press conferences and doing other things.
But do you think it was okay for not just ministers, but also the most senior civil servant in the country to be talking about what was going on about like that, joking on their phones with each other about what was going on? One of your MPs said it looks like teenage lols. It just looks cringeworthy.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is, it really is a partial account of what was going on and kind of almost a view into the psyche of Matt Hancock rather than into the actual decision makings all decisions would have been recorded by civil servants. Lots of cross government meetings in the usual way. But you're seeing it in WhatsApps what Matt was thinking at each. But
I suppose the question is, and those WhatsApps are also from people like Michael Gove, still in government, Simon Case, still the most senior civil servant in the country. I suppose my question is, are viewers watching this morning, are they to believe that you are comfortable with that kind of tone of conversation?
I think viewers would expect that politicians, being human beings, would express things in a human way. And I don't think that you would find one politician that wasn't afraid at the beginning of the lockdown, first lockdown, when we had no idea what the pandemic was going to be. Today's revelations were around the time where there were no vaccines. There was limited testing. I think you've got to put it in the time context as well as everything else, which is why it's important to wait for the inquiry, because the inquiry is going to see all this evidence at the right time. Let's
talk about one of the specific issues, though, and I think we can show some of the messages. Matt Hancock says that Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help scheme was causing problems in intervention. intervention areas, so where there were local COVID outbreaks spiking because of Eat Out to Help Out. Now, he messages that he was trying to keep it out of the news. Now, that's a cover-up, isn't it?
Well, it depends in what context that message was sent. And Eat Out to Help Out was also a scheme to try and keep a whole sector of industry going at one point in time, because we also wanted to protect the economy. We were trying to protect the NHS, protect the economy, protect Britain from a pandemic, and we were doing exactly the same similar things to what other countries were at different times. So, there was no playbook for fighting a pandemic of this nature in modern day British society. And the previous time we had a pandemic, we certainly didn't have WhatsApp. So we would never have known what the politicians of the time, or indeed the scientists of the time, were thinking.
OK, let's talk about a big issue for our viewers and for your party and for many people coming this week. We're expecting in the next couple of days Rishi Sunak to announce new laws to try to stop small boats coming across the channel and arriving this country. Now, the idea is to deport anyone who arrives and to stop them ever from claiming asylum here in this country. The problem is, if anyone's been paying attention, the new laws that are proposed to be brought in are almost identical to the laws that have already been brought in, and they haven't worked. Arrivals are at record levels. So what's the point of new laws?
I've yet to see the new law, and I don't think anybody else has, apart from the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister and maybe a handful of civil servants around it. So I don't think we can authoritatively say that they're exactly the same
Rishi Sunak
as
talked
laws
to the Mail on Sunday about the laws. We've got a pretty good idea.
But we've got to have, we need a full range of things in our arsenal to try and stop both people trafficking and illegal migration across the Channel. That involves proper conversations that are ongoing with our French counterparts and indeed our other European counterparts to try and ensure that people are held in the first safe country that they come to. That also includes international development aid, because you want to try and make sure that the economies and places where people are trying to come from develop themselves, so they don't need to make that journey. And there's a whole piece around legislation as well, which we need to get right.
But can I read you what the team of Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, she brought in lots of new laws to try and address this problem. Her team have called this plan window dressing. Having hyped up what they will do, they haven't come up with anything remotely new. Now, if Priti Patel thinks you already have the laws that you need, what's the point in new legislation? Doesn't it look like you're trying to give the impression of tackling a very complex problem, but they might not have any impact?
So I think my constituents would say we obviously don't have the laws that we need to tackle this problem, because this problem is still ongoing. So there is but it's only part of what needs to be done. And we all know as politicians that we need to reflect on public opinion and actually answer some of these questions. And stopping the boats coming across the English Channel is a very big part in the answer. I was out campaigning in a beautiful village of Stratton in my constituency yesterday. It is very high on people's agenda.
It certainly is, but that's exactly why, is it not, that what the government is proposing is actually something that you can be sure would have a practical effect.
Yeah, and that's what the government would like to think will happen.
So I want to show people what's happened in the last few years. So we've seen the Home Office time after time tighten up the laws under Priti Patel. She believed was the right thing to do, and many people agreed with her. But if you look at what actually happened, and I think we can show our viewers a graph that hopefully will magically appear, back in 2010, when the Conservatives came to power, more than 10,000 asylum seekers were being returned. Now look through this period, during which the law has been tightened up, what has happened? The number has gone down and down and down and down. Now there's no dispute this is a matter of huge public concern, but this suggests that tightening the law is not actually going to have any impact at all.
I mean, we do need to tighten the law, actually, because the law has been challenged on pretty much all those occasions. And equally, when we announced the Rwanda scheme, it was challenged immediately, as you well know. I believe you reported on it. And that was found in the UK High Court to be a legal scheme. But we need to put this all together, because I don't disagree. People will be upset with what they see on that graph, and also how we are. This is something. We accept a huge amount of migration into this country, and we like it because it is really good for our localities, our economy, and just social fabric in general. The one thing in my constituency that upset that balance slightly is numbers of people coming illegally to this country.
But this is about what you do if people arrive. Now, you mentioned the Rwanda scheme there. Even if it does get up and running, as the government hopes it will do, it's not projected to take any more than a few hundred people. The only other deal that the UK has is with Albania. Now, Rishi Sunak's proposal would involve detaining tens of thousands of people. Where are they all going to go? How are you going to? Where are you proposing that you send
This
people?
is why it needs to be. It is part of a whole range of things, a whole gambit of things to try and both keep people in home country or as close to home country as they as we possibly can, to try and make sure that they are looked after in the first free country that they might come to. Try and stop illegal people trafficking, which is a huge part in this, and crack down on that. Legislation at home to return people who come here illegally. There's a whole range of things.
But where are you proposing that people go if they arrive here?
Well, hopefully we'll get to the point when people arrive here, they're arriving legally, and then they become...
But where should they go? It doesn't sound here like what you've got here as a practical proposal for the many thousands of people who have been arriving here in the UK.
No, so I think I'm not accepting your premise, because I don't think there'll be tens of thousands of people coming if we get this right. Certainly illegally. I mean, we're accepting huge numbers of people legally to come to the United Kingdom, but I believe this plan, this complete plan, will do the job.
Well, let's see in the coming days. You were a key part of the team who was trying to keep Boris Johnson in number 10 as the scandal over lockdown parties unfolded. We've talked about it with our panel this morning. We've seen it again splashed over the newspapers in the last few days. And a committee of MPs has clearly said, in their view, there are at least 4 occasions where they believe Boris Johnson might have misled Parliament and the public. Do you agree?
So there are 4 occasions where Boris may have done that. When I became Boris's chief whip, this was halfway through, well, actually probably a third of the way through this period of time. I wouldn't have become Boris's chief whip if I didn't believe him that he did not knowingly mislead Parliament, and I believe him to be an honest man, and he did not knowingly mislead Parliament.
Did you ever ask him directly?
Yes.
And what did he say to you?
He gave me chapter on verse that demonstrated to me that he did not knowingly mislead Parliament and did not know it. He's generally he's an honest man, and I truly believe that.
Is that now the government's official position, that Boris Johnson did not knowingly mislead Parliament?
I don't think it's a government official position.
Well, you're in the cabinet.
There's a parliamentary process going on, and I think that, we would wait to see what came out of that parliamentary process.
But as things stand, you are convinced that he did not knowingly mislead anyone?
I am absolutely convinced.
OK, Chris Eaton-Harris, thank you so much indeed for coming in. It's great to have you here in the studio for the first time. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Now, as you and we read the inside track of how ministers were discussing the pandemic, as I said, described as teenage lols to me by one MP, there was genuine shock this week when news broke that the civil service enforcer, Sue Gray, was leaving government to work for the Labour Party. Now, that led some of Boris Johnson's supporters to claim that he was the victim of some kind of stitch-up. And in lots of ways this week, it feels like we are all reliving some nightmares. Jonathan Ashworth is Labour's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, and he's with us this morning. Good, welcome to you, and we'll come to that in a second. But first of all, I want to go back to this Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Now, Leicester, your constituency, was one of the cities where there were ongoing lockdowns for a very long time.
A long time.
A very long time. Did you have concerns about Eat Out to Help Out at the time?
Well, we obviously had concerns about all kinds of things in the pandemic. And I think what we've seen in the WhatsApp messages, and of course they may well be selective, there's always 2 sides to a story, but I think many people will be deeply troubled by what's been revealed. It's why all of these messages need to be passed to a proper inquiry. We need to get on with that inquiry. It needs to report in some preliminary way by the end of the year. And I also think that Rishi Sunak needs to get a grip of this situation and insist that all ministers hand over everything, that no WhatsApps are deleted. On the specifics of Eat Out to Help Out, I totally understand why the government wanted to support the hospitality sector. We were calling for support for the hospitality sector through those lockdowns. But cities like my own, Leicester, or Bury or Bolton or Bradford were in longer lockdowns over that summer, and we now know that Matt Hancock thought that the infection rates were worse in places like Leicester or Bury or Bolton because of that scheme.
But do you regret not opposing Eat Out to help out? I mean, as we heard Hannah say, scientists thought, well, actually, if you get more people together, obviously you're going to get a spike. Should Labour have opposed Eat Out to help out?
Well, we raised concerns about all kinds of things throughout the pandemic.
But not on Eat Out to help out, if I recall correctly.
Well, I do recall people asking questions about Eat Out to help out. But of course, when we asked questions, we expected, and I don't think this is an unreasonable expectation, that the responses that we were getting were giving us the full picture. And it now turns out that we weren't getting the full picture, which is why we need a public inquiry.
But what did Labour...
we need the public inquiry to get... we need to get on with it.
We have a public inquiry, and I'm sure we'll all talk about the public inquiry a lot in the months to come. But do you look back at that whole period, and it was such a scramble, it was a genuine national emergency. If you are honest with yourself, are there things you look back now and think, you know what, Labour got that wrong?
Well, it was a national emergency, and in the end, you've got to use your judgment in a fast-moving situation.
So are there things Labour got wrong, do you think?
But when I look back and I look at the significant failings throughout that period, care homes. We were raising concerns about care homes and testing of people moving into care homes from the start. We now know from the WhatsApp messages that wider testing of every... We were raising this. We've
covered that, though, Jonathan Ashworth.
No, I know.
What I'm asking at the time is, you were the Shadow Health Secretary.
Yes.
You were intimately involved in all of this, not just because of what was happening in your constituency. But I think, honestly, can you tell us, do you think there were things that Labour got wrong? Are there things you wish you'd shouted about more, opposed more vigorously? Are there things that preoccupy you now?
Well, there are always going to... You always look back on a situation and question things and ask questions about things. And quite right, because you have to learn lessons.
So what?
Because that's why we need an inquiry, because we're going to see more infectious disease outbreaks in the future.
So
hopefully not of this scale.
So what would the things be that you would do differently?
Well, I think when we now look back at that period, I think that... Well, I'm going to talk about sick pay. We actually did continually press the government on sick pay. I still think it was quite a monstrous failing that the government didn't give people adequate sick pay, particularly low-paid workers on insecure contracts, particularly in the care sector. We did raise concerns about care homes. We did raise concerns about giving proper economic support to businesses in areas like Leicester and so on. So, but look, all of this, we reflect on all of this all the time, and we do need an inquiry because, sadly, because of global travel and what's happening in the environment, we're likely to see more pathogens jump to humans, hopefully not on this scale, but we do need to be prepared for the future.
OK, and during that whole period, I mean, people's faith in government was really put to the test. And this week, we've seen, I think, another test of people's faith, maybe not in the public, but in the civil service. Now, the senior civil servant, Sue Gray, widely respected in Whitehall, but she has been recruited to be your leader's chief of staff, which some people, some neutral civil servants and some people on the Conservative backbenches and in government thought was absolutely jaw-dropping. When did the conversations between her and Keir Starmer begin?
Well, let me just say, Sue Gray is a woman of exceptional ability and talents. And the fact that Sue Gray wants to come and work for Keir Starmer, in the same way that business leaders are coming on your programme to endorse the policies of the Labour Party, it shows how seriously people are taking the prospect of Keir Starmer as a Prime Minister and a Labour government,
civil servant.
And in turn, how seriously we are preparing for government.
I'm not questioning her
Should the British
integrity.
people put their trust in us?
I'm not questioning her integrity, but I'm asking, as a neutral civil servant, which she was until very recently, when did she begin conversations with the leader of the opposition?
And you're right not to question her integrity, because she's a woman of integrity.
So when did her conversations with Keir Starmer begin?
Well, first of all, we know that Keir Starmer has been, for several weeks now, looking for someone to fill this role. She was always going to be on the list when we knew there was a vacancy that emerged. She's quite rightly going to go for a process. There are proper procedures in place when a senior civil servant leaves the civil service, and I'm sure she'll set it all out when she has those conversations.
Don't you know when those conversations began?
Well, personally, I've not been privy to them, and I'm not privy to HR decisions in the Labour Party.
But it matters because this is about the neutrality of the civil service and the integrity of the civil service, which for so long has been something that her reputation suggests Sue Gray has taken so dear. The rules state very clearly, if you want to know, it's in the Directory of Civil Service Guidance. It says contact between senior civil servants and members of the opposition should always be cleared with departmental ministers. She was meant to get permission to begin conversations with Keir Starmer. Do you know if that didn't happen? Because if it didn't happen, if she didn't seek permission, then she broke the rules. And Keir Starmer then has been part of breaking the rules that are there to protect the integrity of the civil service.
But you're asking me to speculate on a process when Sue Gray will outline all of this in the proper way, when she will follow the procedures.
Does it matter if she broke the rules?
Well, you're asking me to speculate on something when I'm not been privy to the conversations.
That's not speculation. I'm asking
you're asking me to engage in a hypothetical, if I may say so.
I'm asking you a direct question, Jonathan Ashworth. Does it matter to you if Sue Gray did not follow the rules to the letter when she was talking to Keir Starmer about coming to work for the Labour Party?
I'm confident that Sue Gray is a woman of immense integrity, and she will set all of this out as she follows the proper processes and procedures that one does when you are a senior civil servant and you leave the civil service.
I think the problem that some viewers might find with all of this is everyone understands the civil service is absolutely meant to be beyond reproach, completely neutral. Keir Starmer is someone who, in this studio and very often, sets huge store by integrity, transparency, following the rules to the letter. But the way this has all come out, the way that they have done whatever deal it is for her to go and work for the party, it just creates a sense that actually, when it suits him, he was willing to do something that to some people looks a bit underhand.
No, if I may say so, I disagree with you. I think it shows that a prospect of Keir as a Prime Minister in a Labour government, if we win the trust of the British people, we are taking absolutely nothing for granted. But it shows how seriously people are taking that prospect. And I think it is a good thing that Sue Gray wants to come and work for Keir Starmer.
OK, well, we'll see if we can find out when those conversations began, because rightly or wrongly, it does matter to a lot of people. Now, we're 10 days away from the budget, and as we close, I just want to ask you about, you are the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. You talked to us here before about your plans to get the over 50s back to work. Sounds like the government is going to have something to say about that in the budget next week. Do you think they're going to nick your plan?
Well, I'd be delighted if they nick my welfare reform plans, because I've been setting out plans, not just for the over 50s, but reforms to sickness and disability benefits to encourage more people who are out of work for sickness to return to work. We've also got 1 million young people out of work who are workless. We know if you're out of work when you're young, it risks a life on the margins. It can be devastating. And those young people should be given support. They should be required to interact more with the job centre, required to take on more training opportunities if they've been unemployed for over 6 months, for example. So I really hope they do take on my plans, which is about giving people hope and confidence to get Britain back to work. OK, Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much indeed for coming in. We'll see what the budget holds next week. Thank you to our two politicians. It can be hard to escape the past, whether on the pandemic or Partygate. But Rishi Sunak may well hope to change that subject with the budget, which, as we've said, is coming in 10 days' time. Next week, the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will be here. Let me know your questions for them at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk or the hashtag #BBCLauraK. And you can follow today's conversation on the BBC's live page there as well. Now, we've talked before here about what happens online. It can be great, makes it easy for us to hear from all of you. Or it can go cringeworthily wrong, as Matt Hancock has found out in the last few days. But we've also talked here in this studio about how we grapple with the good and the worst of what can come on our screens, which are at everyone's fingertips. It can affect young and old, everyone, everywhere, from Holyhead to Hollywood. There's a reminder that Kate Winslet, the Oscar winner, voiced her own concerns to us a while ago.
I do definitely feel that the world of social media is frightening to parents because we don't really know what's there. We don't know how our children are using it. We don't know the effect that it's really having on them. We don't know really what's going on in their friendship groups anymore.
Her worry, so many families' worry, is common around the country. And in extreme circumstances, when it goes wrong, it can change lives. Ministers have spent months and months talking about the challenge to pass new laws to tackle the problem. Frankie Thomas was 15 She was vulnerable, and when she was at school one day, she came across content that talked about how to take your life. Sadly, Frankie did just that. Her mum, Judy Thomas, is campaigning, along with Baroness Kidron, the crossbench peer, for more support and more access for families to get information from big tech companies about what might have gone wrong.
We had no idea why Frankie had taken her life, and it was only when we were informed that elsewhere she had accessed things. The coroner in the inquest said that the stories she accessed right at the end, which were about her favourite band, she'd copied because there was content in there about people in the band. It's fictional, taking their own lives, and she copied the methods and the place and everything when she got home. And so that's helped us a little bit to understand what had happened, but also we were still left, as every parent is, with unanswered questions. And we would have really appreciated that platform coming to the inquest as they were requested to, and parents just want to know, what's this all about? Because we were really careful with Frankie because she had special needs, she was vulnerable. And we were absolutely at a loss. We didn't realise Frankie had left a note. Police found it when they came to the house. And she mentioned someone in there that we had no idea who it was. We wrote online to Instagram, to the inquiries, and this went on for about a year with no answers. And it wasn't, look, what have you done? But actually, could you help us? And actually, if we could, if that name wasn't on there or anything on there, that would be fine. It would help us get a bit of closure.
And Judy, we can hear there very clearly how much of a struggle it was for you to get information. What effect did that have on you as a family while you're trying to come to terms with what happened, but also just trying to get to the bottom of it? What effect has it had?
I'm not trying to be sentimental. That isn't the purpose of this. We were absolutely in a wilderness. And that sounds pathetic, doesn't it? But we just wanted someone to come alongside. We wanted to speak to somebody and just say, would you help us? And, we were devastated. And also, obviously, as parents, how had we failed her and all this sort of thing? We just wanted to know.
This is obviously such a distressing situation, and the attitude, Beeban, that the tech companies took while Judy and her family were searching for answers was obviously so hard for them to deal with. We know the government is trying to come up with this legislation to help people deal with what can go wrong online, but as the bill stands, do other parents still face this kind of terrible distress?
As it stands currently, they do. And that's why I've put forward an amendment with, I have to say, the most comprehensive support of other peers and other politicians in the Commons. Because, we're struggling to keep a dry eye here in the studio as Judy speaks. And Judy speaks, I've known her many years and she has fought valiantly. There is nothing that she and her husband Andy have not done to try and get this information. The inquest has opened and closed without the information being given to them. And we cannot have it that it's a sort of, maybe I will, maybe I won't, I'll tell you this, I won't tell you that. We have to have a proper, formal route for parents and for coroners to get the kind of information that we need to see.
Well, we should say in this case we've been in touch with the tech firms involved. Wattpad say they sent a robust witness statement to the coroner. Meta, who of course own Instagram, said this is a challenging and complex issue. They say we have been in touch with the family and we want to be as helpful as we can during this time. But do you accept, Beeban, having campaigned on this for a long time, that it's not easy? to do any of this. And sometimes the big tech firms say, well, look, actually, we're being asked to meet sort of impossible standards.
No, I don't accept that. And I think that, you know, the tech firms are largely sympathetic to this amendment so that we have in law what the route is. And my amendment is very practical because it's...
So tell us then practically what change are you trying to make to the law?
So the Online Safety Bill gives a lot of powers to Ofcom. And what I'm saying is let's make Ofcom the interlocutor between parents and coroners. And so if a coroner asks for information, that they immediately have the powers that Ofcom have put at their disposal to stop companies...
So that there's a mechanism for families like Judy to go to Ofcom, the regulator, say, we want to find out what happened. They can then make that happen.
Yeah, and Laura, you know, I got an email from Judy, but my inbox, since I've taken up this issue, is full of bereaved families who want access to data. And I think this is the really important thing, that the coronial service has not managed to get that information, families have not managed to get that information, and it is inhuman. I mean, the sort of distress that is happening all these years later is unacceptable. One is we need access to the data on a basis that is managed and private for other users. And the other thing is the transparency that it gives. We only know what is really going on when we see it in open court.
Judy, this campaign is now pushing, as we've heard, for changes to the law. Do you have confidence that things might change?
In some ways, I think I despair. But it would be so brilliant if they now take the opportunity, the government, to act.
I'd like to close our conversation, Judy, though, with something slightly different. How would you like Frankie to be remembered?
She wanted to stand for things that were right. She honestly did. I remember someone coming up to me, a youngster coming up to me when they realised who I was. And they said, are you Frankie's mum? And I said, yes. And they said, just want you to know that somebody came up to bully me and she stood in front of them. She wouldn't have it. She was like that.
Judy, Frankie's mum, thank you so much for sharing your experiences this morning. And Beban Kidron, thank you very much. Of course, the government is pushing this bill through Parliament right now, but you know we'll continue to keep a close eye on this issue on this programme. Judy and Beban, thank you so much. Judy Thomas sharing her story there, and details of organisations that offer information and support on those kinds of issues if they affect you are available at bbc.co.uk/action line, or you can call at any time for free to hear recorded information on the number there, 08000 155 947. There is information out there to help people if they find themselves in a distressing situation. Let's talk to our panel. I mean, Sam, when you listen to that story, the evident heartbreak in that family and their frustration to get information from the tech companies, what do you feel?
It's just heartbreaking. It makes me feel really angry. You know, my kids are young enough to start using YouTube Kids, and you know they're going to be more and more into the internet. You know, I speak at schools regularly, TikTok, you know, WhatsApp, all sorts of things, sharing things in such rapid terms. You can easily see how the acceleration of bullying and all sorts of things have happened. I think what's ironic is that companies that make billions of pounds out of social networking in terms of connecting human beings together are actually turning out to be completely faceless corporations, stonewalling parents who are bereaved and grieving. So, I mean, I'll certainly be looking at the suggestions that have been put forward. I know the Labour Party will as well. I mean, I do think things need to toughen up, and these internet companies, you know, social media companies need to be held account.
And there is, for context, a huge piece of legislation which is going through Parliament, which would, for the first time, you know, put the tech companies to an extent on the spot in the way that they haven't been before. But Fraser, do you acknowledge that it is a difficult, complicated issue? You know, the government's been wrangling about it for a long time, and there's been a big discussion about freedom of speech and whether or not legislation might actually impinge on what people should be allowed to express.
Of course, it's incredibly difficult. This is territory which politicians themselves just simply don't understand.
Do you think they don't get it?
No, I think we don't get it. Yeah, there are some black and white cases, like it's obvious it should be illegal to promote suicide, illegal to promote terrorism, drugs. But beyond that, there is a dangerous area where effectively they bring in the censorship for the first time of the government by what's said and promoted. So you can end up with stories that might go against the grain. I can think as an editor, so often we come up against this new breed of censorship bots. So if we ever cover mocking Joe Biden, that was a casualty of it. We had a piece by scientists about the efficacy of face masks, that became a casualty as well. So you end up, because these social media companies, they don't really care about free speech. They just make advertising out of daft videos. So they're quite happy if they think the government doesn't want them to promote things, to promote junk and to make sure, because Facebook is now the #1 source of news in this country outside the broadcasters. So control over what Facebook shows, if in government hands, raises big questions.
But Hannah, one of the things you do is you work a lot with technology and the sort of power of maths to harness technology for the good. But from where you sit, do you think a modern government is capable, actually, of grappling with this challenge in a way that can protect people in the right way?
It's hard, and I do think that there are problems with literacy around this stuff. I think that if you don't have a technical background, if you don't understand the sort of nuances of these questions, they are hard to kind of come in and take a view on. I think also as people, as we've seen with the latest round of chatbots, I think that people have this habit of thinking of AI as though it's some kind of deity, rather than thinking of it as though it's some kind of entity like Wikipedia or whatever. And I think that actually what that means is the algorithms and the way that they're changing the structure of our society don't really get criticised and questioned in quite the way that they would if they were, if I think they were a bit more transparent.
That's an interesting point. So what do you mean? How would we question an algorithm? You can't invite an algorithm to the studio on a Sunday morning, or I'm not sure what it would look like if we tried to do that.
These algorithms are deciding what we're reading to an extent that politicians simply don't understand. It's a major threat to democracy. How do you cope with where they've got more power over our lives than we would ever have imagined?
OK, we must leave it there, but we'll hear from you all at the end of the programme. Thank you so much for now, and it's a very difficult issue, and we do want to say thank you again to Julie Thomas for sharing her story with us, and we will keep an eye on this issue and the bill as it goes through Parliament. Now, it's not so long ago that Nicola Sturgeon told us here on this programme that she had plenty left in the tank. That didn't quite turn out to be true, and the contest for her job is hotting up. Last week we spoke to Humza Yousaf, who fancies it. Now let's talk to Ash Regan, another contender to be Scotland's next First Minister. And Ash reckons that the Westminster government would be willing to negotiate another Scottish independence referendum. Not quite how Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer see it, but let's hear from her. She joins us from Edinburgh. Good morning to you, Ash. Good morning. The biggest point of difference between you and your opponents really is how quickly you would want to dash for independence. What would your plan be to make it happen?
Yes, I think the speed at which we move to independence is important because I want to focus on the things that are important to the people of Scotland. I want to focus on their priorities. So at the moment, that's things like NHS recovery, environment, net zero, the cost of living crisis, and access to the single market. And so I see Scotland being able to govern its own affairs as actually crucial in how we make Scotland a better country to live in for everyone.
But SNP members, though, were very interested about how you would achieve their desire of getting Scotland to be an independent country. So how would you do that?
Yes. Obviously, people that are members of the SNP think that Scotland should govern itself, that it's entirely natural for countries to take control of their own affairs. So what I'm setting out is that the First Minister, if I'm chosen to be leader of the party, will focus on the priorities of the country. That's things like the NHS, the environment and so on. That I will set up an independence convention, and that will be for all the pro-independence parties, it will be for civil society, academics, think tanks, businesses, and everyone to get involved with making that case for independence, and that will be the campaigning side. And we need to work together in unity, I believe, in order to make this work. And then the other part of this plan that I have is that I'll set up an independence commission. So your viewers might not have heard of that before. And the idea behind this is that that will be a body that will be tasked with planning for independence and creating the infrastructure to get Scotland ready for independence.
How would you actually make it happen, though? So you've previously said that if pro-independence parties got 50% plus one of the votes cast in an election, that would be an instruction that you would expect the UK government to say, OK, we can talk about independence now. Now, why do you think they would do that? Because Labour and the Conservatives have repeatedly said they couldn't see a general election as a vote for independence. It's not the same as a referendum.
Well, it is the same as a referendum if you think about it, in terms of the fact that it's the ballot box. So that's a perfectly normal way for, to test the will of what the public is. My opponents in this contest are setting out a system where they are going to have an election that's based on independence, and they're going to use that as what they're calling it, like a moral mandate, to go back to Westminster and to ask them again for another referendum. And we know that's not going to happen. The London government's been very clear that it doesn't think it's going to agree to have a referendum anytime soon. We know this. So I don't think that's the way to go about this. What Westminster is doing at the moment is it's trying to stop Scotland expressing its democratic will. I think that's not tenable. I don't think that's credible. So what I'm suggesting is that the gold standard here, in fact, is not a referendum. The gold standard here is the ballot box. So I'm proposing that we give the power over when Scotland should become an independent country, and that it's not anything to do really with what Westminster think. It's not even to do with what I think. This is a question for the people of Scotland.
But how would you
and we should give that
make
power
that happen,
to the people of Scotland?
Because as the law stands, there is no connection between the results of a general election and Scotland becoming an independent country. So how practically would you make it happen?
So what I'm suggesting is that we run each and every election in Scotland, so that would be the general elections and also the Scottish elections, as a test of public opinion, for a trigger point, if you like. And if we get the majority of votes cast, and let's just remember that this is a previous SNP policy that used to be accepted by the London government as entirely legitimate.
Well, no, it's accepted in the context of a referendum. It's never been accepted in the context of a general election.
This was a previous SNP policy that if we got the majority, I think previously it was a majority of seats, but I'm making it a slightly tougher test and saying that it should be the majority of votes cast, and that was previously accepted by the London government, that this was a legitimate way for Scotland to express its views.
But I'm still struggling to understand, Ashrigan, how you practically think you could turn the results of a general election into making the government in Westminster say, fine, Scotland can have its independence, because there is no suggestion from anybody in the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, who are the two likely parties, however it all casts out to form the next government. What is it that you believe is going to change if indeed you had that kind of result in a general election? I can't see what you're saying that would make it happen practically.
Well, it would be practical because it would be clearly set out. So people in Scotland would know that what they were voting for was to get the government in Edinburgh and the government in Westminster together to negotiate Scotland's exit. So Scotland would be very clear what they were voting for. The UK would be very clear what Scotland would be voting for, and the international community would be very clear about what Scotland is voting for. So I don't think there's any question of the UK government not recognising Scotland's democratic choice. And we must remember that there is international law operating here. Of course, there's the UN Charter, Article 1.2, which says that the right to self-determination must be respected.
OK, you first came to public prominence for a lot of people when you resigned from the Scottish Government over their plans to cut the age at which people could legally change their gender to 16. That has, though, your position has created some concern among some of the trans community who are seeking reassurance in Scotland that all of the candidates wouldn't roll back the rights for the trans community. Do you want to give that assurance today?
Yes, I'm a committed progressive. I did have concerns about the way that bill was drafted. If I'd been in charge of drafting that bill, I don't think we would have got quite into the position that we did, where what we ended up with was a conflict of rights. So I can say quite confidently today that if I become the First Minister, I will make sure I protect and promote everyone's rights. But I will be very clear that there'll be no compromise on the rights for women under, if I was to become the First Minister.
And just lastly, this week when you were talking about independence, you suggested the idea that you were interested in of a physical readiness thermometer to monitor how close independence was for Scotland as a country. You suggested it could be some kind of even installation somewhere in a public place. Can you just explain what that might be and what the purpose would be?
Yes, what I was explaining to you earlier about the Independence Commission. So the idea behind this is that we build confidence in the public by explaining to them what we're doing to get Scotland ready. So this is actual infrastructure. So this would be things like planning for the currency and getting that all that stuff arranged. And what we want to do is we want to have some sort of representation or an index, perhaps is maybe a better way of expressing it, so that the public and the media and everyone that's interested can see the progress that we're making towards setting up that infrastructure in order to build confidence with the public that Scotland is ready to take control of its own affairs. OK, Ash Regan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. There are a few weeks left in that race, and if you win, then do come back and talk to us as the new First Minister. Now it's nearly 10, and we started this morning asking why it's so hard for the UK government to escape the recent past. This is what the Cabinet Minister, Chris Heaton-Harris, had to say about the government's handling of the pandemic and Ministers' use of instant messaging.
It really is a partial account of what was going on, and kind of almost a view into the psyche of Matt Hancock rather than into the actual decision makings that was. All decisions would have been recorded by civil servants. Lots of cross government meetings in the usual way. But you're seeing it in WhatsApps what Matt was thinking at each occasion.
Let's have some final thoughts from our panel, Fraser Nelson, Hannah Fry and Sam Tarry. We've had lots of emails on the show today. Jerry Tassel wants to ask, and I want to ask you, why is internal government discussion taking place through apps like WhatsApp? Now, Fraser, forgive me for calling you a Westminster insider, but you are. Why does it all happen on here?
It's a very good question. It's a complete outrage if that ever happened. And that's one of the major disclosures that we've learned, that the decisions that govern so many of millions of people were taken on. And what struck me, if you read all of these messages, is what's not there, not what it is. Like, where is the evidence? Where is the science we repeatedly assured? So to think that when you suspend democracy, when you take emergency powers, you then let a group of men send WhatsApp messages and decide who should be allowed outside and who shouldn't, that is what we now know that we didn't before. It's a culture which should never be allowed to happen again.
Isn't it just the culture in politics and maybe in lots of other professions as well? I mean, Sam, doesn't the Labour Party also run on WhatsApp?
Yeah, I mean, Labour's had its own disclosures about WhatsApp. But I think there's a serious point. You can go to the National Archives in Kew, you can see things that Winston Churchill wrote. Are we going to get Matt Hancock's there for posterity's sake to analyse that? Because this is the thing that Fraser's right. They're taking decisions by WhatsApp, not involving civil servants, not through the formal channels. And that is, I think, a dereliction of government, definitely.
And Sam, as you're here, some viewers will know that actually you've been booted out of your seat in Ilford South because you made the leadership a bit cross for various reasons, and there was a vote in your constituency. But without going into the details, what is your plan? Are you going to try and stand as a Labour candidate anyway?
Well, look, I'm absolutely challenging the integrity of that result, and I fully intend to be standing as a Labour candidate at the next election, absolutely.
And Hannah, great to have you back in the studio, but tell us about your latest project. You'll be back on our screens if people want more. Hannah Fry.
Yes, so it's all about the future of technology and the impact on society. And it's a show with Bloomberg Originals that you can find on Bloomberg.com.
OK, from now? From
now, yeah, it's called The Future with Hannah Fry.
The future with Hannah Fry.
Say what you see.
Well,
right?
There we are. Well, thank you for being with us very much here in the present today. All three of you have been great to have you. Sam Tarry, Hannah Fry and Fraser Nelson. We've had a flavour this morning of the arguments that may come in over the rights and wrongs of lockdown. Now, as a country, we've had a little bit of time to process what went on, but more revelations on all of that are expected in the coming days about who said what privately and to whom during the pandemic. And in a fortnight or so, Boris Johnson will be questioned in public on Partygate too. Rishi Sunak, for his part, wants to crack on. An announcement on small boats is coming in the next couple of days, a meeting with the French president as well. But the party, the parliament and the public too are all products of the past, as we all are. What we've just lived through is still present in all of our minds. And the spectacle of sweary WhatsApps and brutal political calculation maybe doesn't do much for public trust. You can watch anything again on the iPlayer as ever, or I'll see you here next Sunday. Goodbye till then.
I'm not trying to defend Boris Johnson here, but didn't Rishi fucking Sunak get a fucking fine as well? I mean, I'm just saying. They both broke the fucking law, right? I mean, where's the pictures of fucking Rishi and shit? I mean, the whole government's fucking a clown fucking show anyway. Just get them out. I don't fucking. The fact that they're still in government is mind-boggling. Just how the fuck are these fucking people still in power after crashing the pound is just mind-blowing. Anywho, whatever. Crap show today. It can't be fucking arsed. Right. Football time.